One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
Dead, buried, cremated.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. Won't hurt.
Australia's basically done for. We'll just end up being a third-rate economy. You know, a banana republic.
How good is Australia?
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Institute, and today we're bringing you guests from our 2020 webinar series, Jay Weatherill and Kate Carnell, talking about the economic importance of quality, universally accessible early childhood learning.
Childcare and early childhood education is critical.
So the free childcare scheme has been a huge help during the coronavirus pandemic.
We're spending $9 billion a year on childcare.
So we're continuing to support childcare in record amounts.
Thousands of parents are facing the prospect of removing kids from childcare when it stops being free on July 12.
The scheme has done its job, according to the Minister, keeping most childcare centres open during the worst of the crisis.
The system was designed for when demand was falling. Now we're seeing demand increasing.
Parts of the sector are utterly bewildered by today's announcement and the revelation that its workforce is losing access to the JobKeeper wage subsidy from the 20th of July.
They believe the big spending budget was a missed opportunity to make childcare cheaper and more accessible, helping parents to work more, as well as creating jobs in a sector dominated by women.
I haven't heard of any other sector or industry that's been kicked off JobKeeper.
We've then got children who will miss out on all of the proven benefits of early childhood education and care, but it's also going to make it more difficult for families to return to work if and when they can find a job.
That it offered absolutely nothing in terms of participation in the workforce for women.
But for a crisis that's disproportionately affected female workers in what's being dubbed the pink recession, there are fears today's announcement will disadvantage women even further.
The Australia Institute was an early advocate of the benefits of quality and accessible early learning, not just for young families and single parents, but as a driver of long-term economic growth. We've released economic modelling that shows that funding childcare would be 20 times more effective at creating jobs than providing income tax cuts. So quality, accessible early learning is not only good for kids and for parents, it's good for the economy. And that's why we were delighted to speak to Jay Weatherill, CEO of the Minderoo Foundation's Thrive by 5 initiative, which aims to ensure that all Australian children have the best start to life by investing in and advocating for effective early childhood development outcomes. Jay Weatherill also obviously served as the 45th Premier of South Australia and is the South Australian Labor Party's longest continuing serving Minister of the Crown. Kate Carnell is the inaugural Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman and the former Chief Minister of the ACT from 1995 to 2000. And Jay and Kate were in conversation with our Chief Economist, Richard Denniss. This was recorded live on Wednesday the 11th of November, and things may have changed since recording. So Australia is in the middle of a recession, and the only way out of it is to reduce unemployment and encourage growth. Early on in the pandemic, the Morrison government announced that childcare would be free, especially for essential workers, one of the best policy announcements of the Morrison government. But it was sadly scrapped after just a few months. And the Australia Institute has been a really early advocate of the benefits of quality and accessible early learning and childcare, not just for young families and single parents, but as a driver of economic growth. In June, we released research showing that by increasing the labour force participation of women to the levels seen in many Nordic countries, through policies such as free childcare and early learning, the Australian economy would be up to $140 billion larger. And just today, we've released economic modelling showing that funding childcare would be about 20 times more effective at creating jobs than tax cuts. You can find that on our website. So quality, accessible early learning is not only good for kids and parents, it's great for the economy. And that's why today I'm delighted to introduce our special guests, Jay Weatherill and Kate Carnell. Jay Weatherill is the CEO of Minderoo Foundation's Thrive by 5 initiative, which aims to ensure all Australian children have the best start to life by investing in and advocating for effective early childhood development outcomes. Jay also served as the 45th Premier of South Australia, and he's the South Australian Labor Party's longest continuing serving Minister of the Crown. Kate Carnell is the inaugural Australian Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman and the former Chief Minister of us here in the ACT. She has also served as the CEO for the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, or ACCI, the Food and Grocery Council, and Beyond Blue. And today they'll be in discussion with our Chief Economist, Richard Denniss. Thank you so much and welcome, Jay Weatherill and Kate Carnell, and thank you to you, Richard. Jay Weatherill, my first question is for you. Could you just kick us off by telling us a little bit about Thrive by 5, the campaign you're running, and why you are so focused on improving quality and accessible access to early learning?
Well, thanks, Ebony, and I'm coming to you from the lands of the Wadjuk people and the Noongar Nation, and here in Perth. And yeah, it's all of the arguments that you've just outlined about how critically important the first 5 years are for children and their development and indeed their lifelong learning, health and wellbeing trajectory, as well as the really powerful economic arguments about women's participation in the workforce. In a sense, those arguments have been understood for quite some time. But what the COVID crisis has done is really revealed first, the essential nature of early learning services and the way in which they sustain our whole economy. They've been, if we ever needed any reminding, we've been reminded that they are essential services. But the crisis also revealed how precarious our system of early childhood is at the moment. So we had really a health system that largely stood up and a school system that largely stood up, but an early education system that fell over. And so, in a way, it's revealed two things. One, the critical nature of it, but also its essential weaknesses. And so, as Kate will tell you, not every great idea gets a run politically. You can having a good argument is necessary, but not sufficient to get change. You have to build something stronger than that. That is a movement for change where a lot of people all decide that this is the most important thing at that particular point in history. And so in a way, the crisis has actually put early childhood on the agenda in a way that it just simply hasn't been before. And we have to maintain that momentum and build essentially the case for change. There's a lot of people in the sector that have been calling for a high quality sort of early learning system or early childhood development system for a long time. But the sector is not strong enough by itself. It needs to build a broader coalition across a whole range of domains. And apart from the brain story and how children's brains develop and the power of that argument, there are two other really important constituencies that can come on the journey with us and create this pressure for change. The first is working families. About 27% of the family income disappears in childcare costs, which is really expensive at a time in people's lives when they're already facing lots of other pressures and challenges. So young families, we put a lot of pressure on young families with our current system. And those same young families typically live in outer suburban areas and they vote. And they also influence elections. And this is a cohort that any political party is very interested in attempting to tap into. So I think there's a rich vein of political opportunity for the first party that actually steps up and says we're going to meet the needs of those young working families in the outer suburban areas. And then the other group, which is really a number of things you've touched on today in your contribution in the introduction, is women. I mean, we've got a system that basically doesn't support women. Indeed, it punishes them if they want to work any more than part-time. And that gender sort of discrimination that's embedded in our system is a powerful motivator for a lot of women. And They know it, they feel it, they understand it, and they're none too pleased about it. And of course, this isn't entirely an issue about women. I mean, it's typically the woman who's the second income earner, 90% of the cases, and they're the ones that are making those marginal adjustments to their career. They're the ones that are making the sacrifice. It would be great if we had, a more even spread of responsibilities around the care and education and of children, but presently that's not how the world works. Although there are many more men that actually are wanting to participate and play a larger role in the lives of their children. So it's not exclusively a women's issue, but it certainly disproportionately affects women. That is a constituency which is incredibly powerful to mobilise. So those three things, the brain story and how children develop, is highly motivating for everyone. The cost of living story is highly motivating for those working families that are experiencing it. And the gender discrimination story, which is embedded in our present system of the way in which the so-called childcare system works, they can all be sewn together in a narrative which can create great pressure for change.
Thank you, Jay. Kate, I might ask the next question to you. Can you just explain a little bit more, I guess, some of the impacts that we have seen on those in the small business community, and by and large, maybe whether or not that's primarily women or men as far as the data you've got?
Sure. Look, thanks, Ebony. I'm going to approach this from a really different perspective to Jay, but we come to exactly the same position at the end of the day. Australia has 2.3 million businesses, of which the majority, 97%, are small businesses. So small businesses employ half the workforce. They make up half the economy, or a bit more, depending on your definition of small businesses. In 2018, 76% of all new jobs came from small to medium businesses. So if we're talking about jobs, we're talking about economic growth, then it's really important that small to medium businesses, SMEs, are supported. Now, all sides of politics will talk about SMEs as the engine room of the economy. There's a whole range of policies at state level and federal level to try to help small businesses through the current issues around COVID, around economic, around a recession and so on. But I'm going to talk about this now from the perspective of what small business looks like. 38% now of small businesses are owned by women. That percentage is growing quite quickly. As we know, small businesses have been affected by the COVID crisis at a greater level than larger businesses for a whole range of reasons. Some of it's the sectors that they're in, but, it is a significant difference. So what we've got is a whole range of businesses run by women in areas like hospitality and tourism and travel and retail and so on, that are struggling to get their businesses up and running again. The problem is a very large percentage of those businesses, those women, have a young family. So their revenue's down in their business. They're really struggling to get back on track, but they can't afford childcare. They can't afford the childcare to allow them to work full-time, which is what they need to do. Remember, full-time in small business is often a whole lot more than 38 hours a week. So their need for long day childcare and so on is really quite specific. So if we want that engine room of the society, of our society, if we want those businesses to be up and running, to be employing, to be adding to productivity and to economic growth, then we've got to give that very large 38% of small businesses, those women, the opportunity to get back into the workforce full-time. And the only way we'll do that is with affordable childcare. I'll just run on to just a couple of other issues really quickly.
Sure.
You know, we talk a lot about a lack of women in senior management positions or on boards. And remember, a whole range of reasons that that happens is because women and I know this can be men, but I'm using women because it is the majority in this space, have, you know, large percentage of time outside the workforce, fundamentally because, you know, childcare is incredibly expensive. If we can encourage women to stay in the full-time workforce, as Canada has, as some of the Nordic countries have, we've got much, much more chance of getting more women into senior management positions simply because they won't have the time out of the workforce or in the part-time workforce as we have at the moment. And, you know, interestingly, Credit Suisse did some research a couple of years ago, and they found that companies with more than 15% of women in senior management were 50% more profitable than those businesses that had less than 10%. So the reality is this is a lot. So by having more women in senior management positions, we deliver a more profitable companies. That's more tax, more jobs, more economic growth. So across the board here in the business space, it is absolutely essential to change the scenario right now where many women can't afford to work full-time because of the weirdness of our current support for childcare, e.g. working 3 days a week is the same thing to do. You know, you end up working, if you're on an average income, for $2 an hour on Thursdays and for nothing on Fridays. Women aren't silly, so they work part-time. And that has huge impacts on small business, but also impacts upon the economy more broadly in terms of productivity and participation.
Yeah, on that note, I might ask you, Richard, just to talk a little bit about the economics of childcare and early learning. We've obviously published some modelling today, but also research earlier in the year looking at that issue of women's participation. Why is early learning and childcare a good idea, economically speaking?
Look, if you wanted to grow the economy and if you wanted to create jobs in the medium term, if that was your goal, there is literally nothing better that you could do from a public policy point of view than make childcare more affordable, ideally make it completely free. This is unarguable. I really don't know a trained economist who would disagree with the assertion that spending money on free childcare will get you a lot more jobs and a lot more growth than spending the same amount of money on tax cuts. I literally can't think of a trained economist who would argue with that assertion. Now, why is that? Well, it's obvious. If you give middle-aged, high-income blokes like me a tax cut, that's very kind. Thank you very much. Great. I'll go spend some of that money. I'm not going to work any harder. Okay, I have a full-time job. You cannot stimulate me to work more with a small tax cut. Whereas if you took that same money and you employed people to work in childcare, and those childcare workers then made it easier for parents with caring responsibility to work more, then obviously you create more jobs when you spend it directly creating jobs where the jobs you create help other people to go and work more. Like, it really is unarguable. And guess what? If the argument is if you give Richard a tax cut, he'll go out for dinner and create a job, you know what happens when you employ a childcare worker? They spend the money too. But not only do they spend the money too, they go to work every day, making it possible for multiple parents to also go to work every day. And they all go out and buy a dinner. So, yeah, according to the modelling we put out today, you literally get more than 20 times as many jobs spending the same amount on free childcare as you get on tax cuts. 20 times. But despite a decade of talking about the need to cut taxes in Australia, The government has not produced a single piece of evidence, not one, that says if we wanted to create jobs, if that was our number one goal, here's the evidence that says tax cuts would do a better job of that than spending money on childcare. It's just a big lie. There's plenty of them in Australia. Hard to get a bigger one than that. But, hey, it's worked for a decade. Maybe it'll work for another decade.
Yeah. Just before I come back to Jay Weatherill, Richard, just quickly, why is participation and improving participation so important in a recession that we find ourselves in now?
Look, it's important always. What we want to do is if we want to grow the economy, we want to get as many people who are willing and able to work with the skills that people need into the jobs on offer. And the quicker we can do that, the quicker we grow our way out of this incredible problem that has been caused for us by the pandemic. So some people might say, look, unemployment's high at the moment, so let's just keep the ladies and the kids at home right now. This is a terrible idea for all sorts of reasons. One, it's unfair, but two, it's incredibly inefficient because people who are at home caring for kids who are saying no to more hours of work because childcare is so expensive are not direct substitutes for someone else who's unemployed over here. What we need to do is combine all the people who want work with all the people who've got jobs going. The quicker we can match those people up, the better. The more effective the match of the skills that are required and the training that already exists, the quicker and better we can do that, the quicker we grow the economy and the quicker that the flow-on benefits arise for everybody. It's not a zero-sum game. We're trying to lift the whole tide here.
Jay Weatherill, coming back to you, can you tell us a little bit more about what some of the barriers are in terms of making early learning and childcare high quality and affordable and or accessible at the moment?
Yeah, well, the principal barrier is cost. Obviously, it's one of the most expensive in comparable countries anywhere in the world. It's not just the absolute cost for the family, it's the way in which the interaction between the childcare benefit and the eligibility criteria means that the effective rate of taxation, I think it's now been described as the effective marginal disincentive rate. Some modelling's been done by some finance houses, which has added the costs of childcare together with the rate of withdrawal of childcare benefit and family benefits. And it essentially means that you're facing between 100% or 120% effective taxation rate for working on day 4 and 5. So it means that essentially, unless you're willing to pay for the privilege of going to work, you are actually being disadvantaged by taking on those additional days of work. And of course, some women do that because they want to keep their place in the queue. They realise that it's sort of a bit of career death to step out of the workplace in that way. But many others of them actually find themselves going below that minimum where they get involved in some of the key decision makers, which constrains their career choices. So, for instance, if you're in a law firm and you drop below that sort of threshold, some of the bigger cases you might otherwise have been allocated to, you're just excluded from. And so this incrementally sort of has an effect on your career progression. You get shuffled to the back of the queue, and so this is a real challenge. So it's principally about the cost, but then we've also got a perverse system where it doesn't seem to matter how much subsidy the Commonwealth puts in, cost doesn't go down, and quality doesn't seem to be dramatically improving. Certainly wages for early educators aren't going up, and that is probably the single most important effect on quality. I mean, if you can't actually attract and retain the best and brightest people to work in this sector, it's going to be a real issue. And the consistency, the ability for somebody, I mean, there's frightening numbers about the number of people who work in this sector who are actually thinking of leaving. I think it's almost a third of people who work in the childcare or early learning sector are saying they're looking for another job. if you're a teacher in that setting, you're paid about a third that your counterparts in the school-based sector are getting. So it just doesn't make sense financially for people to stay there, and a lot of people are doing it just out of goodwill. But that's precarious, and the consistency of those relationships is crucial, because that's how trust is built between children and adults, and between parents and the practitioners, and this has a profound effect on quality.
And just to keep picking up on quality there, early learning educators, how important is that, and what do we know now about how important that is for young children, basically, in their development?
Well, the development of children has to be intentional. It's not accidental. There's no, getting it wrong is possible. This is a highly skilled and highly valuable profession, but we're not treating it as such. And it's the same with parenting. We just sort of assume that somehow, what we now know about how a child's brain develops is that, 1 million neural connections are made every second during this critical development phase of a child's life. Yet there's very little preparation for parents to play the most important role in their life. And many of them are overwhelmed. Like, even the most fortunate family can feel overwhelmed when the child arrives. It's anyone's experienced it knows it's tough. And that's without any problems. That's without challenges in your life. So, we don't support parents. We don't put information in their hands that allows them to be the best parents they can be. We don't value educators and understand that the critical role they play in translating the neuroscience and putting that, they're the bridge between the neuroscience and the children. So this is a really important role, and it needs to be much better supported than it is at the moment.
Ebony, can I just add something to that? With my Beyond Blue hat on for a moment, I'm still Deputy Chair of Beyond Blue. The evidence is really strong that early intervention is incredibly important in the mental health space generally, and that children who come from families where there might be a single parent, where there's low socioeconomic issues, and potentially the parent that they're living with has some issues as well, but there's no support, are much more likely to experience mental health issues themselves. Now, that's not exactly surprising, except that the cost to our society of not having that early intervention approach, support for those single parents or others that might be struggling, is really quite significant. And I think we've got to, always remember that there is huge cost benefits of having good quality early intervention. That's childcare for those children who come from those sorts of families.
Thanks, Kate. Richard, is there anything that you want to add to that?
Look, just to reinforce that, we're told the only thing standing between us and doing this is the cost of doing so. How ridiculous. The federal government is literally promising to spend hundreds of billions of dollars on tax cuts. So we've never had a government with so much money burning a hole in its pocket. We're told that the number one priority is to create jobs. So we've got the money, we're told the priority is jobs. We've got pretty much every economist agreeing that getting more women with kids into the workforce is the best and easiest way to boost growth in the long run. So let's be clear, there is no barrier to doing this except that we don't want to, or except that we'd prefer to give Richard a tax cut. So it's an amazing kind of point in public policy, because usually we have all these kind of artificial barriers put up. Oh, we have to get the budget back into surplus. Oh, we have to do this, we have to do that. No, we don't. Like, everyone agrees we don't. And we've literally got hundreds of billions of dollars heading out the door in tax cuts. If we took a small slice of that, and this is what our modelling shows, if you took a small slice of that and you said, what if instead of giving Richard such a big tax cut, we just spent some of that on childcare, what would the long run benefits be? Well, they'd be 20 times greater. But then again, there's overwhelming evidence that suggests we should do preventative health. There's overwhelming evidence that says we should ban junk food advertising to kids. There's overwhelming evidence that suggests we should tackle climate change. And hey, it's a democracy. There's nothing in the Constitution says we have to be smart or nice. And there's nothing in the Constitution says we have to maximise GDP growth. But if we wanted to, we could be smart and nice and maximise GDP all at the same time, just by helping parents get affordable childcare. But it seems like we've got other priorities.
Andrew Scott, if you're on the line, I've just promoted you to a panellist, and I'd like to come to you shortly. Andrew heads up the Australia Institute's Nordic Policy Centre. But first, back to you, Jay Weatherill. We actually did see, as I mentioned at the beginning, the Morrison government make early learning free and childcare free during the pandemic. What do you think we learned from that, and why do you think the Morrison government moved so decisively? And how much has that changed the game in terms of what we know is possible now?
Yeah, well, first it revealed to people that big things are possible. So that's the first thing, is it created a sense of space, political space, for big things to happen. So that was crucial. The second thing, I think, it was a recognition that the system was so in near collapse that it had to switch off the old system and turn on this temporary system. So that in a sense was pretty positive, that we had a pretty big problem, and sort of had to be switched off twice, because it had to be switched off again during the Victorian crisis. Mm-hmm. And this is the second time in a decade that that's happened. So it told us that there's a problem here that has to be fixed. But I think it also gave us a very brief little snap. Well, it also revealed something else. When the CPI figures came out, where childcare was switched off, only 11% of the population actually used childcare, but it had a full 1% effect on the CPI. It shows you, so in other words, 11% of people, and that wasn't for the full quarter, because I think 8 days of the quarter actually weren't covered by the new childcare scheme, showed you that very small proportion of working families were, basically experiencing a very large cost burden. So that tells you something about, the size of this effect. And then I suppose the other thing is that we learned, even though it was a brief period, there was a bunch of people came into childcare centres, or early learning centres as we prefer to call them, for the first time. And because the system's not really designed for people that don't have a job. It creates lots of barriers and hurdles if you're not in that world of work. Yet, paradoxically, they're some of the families that would most benefit from high quality early learning. And so we saw a bunch of new families come in for the first time, which was interesting. And so I think it revealed lots of things about the possibilities that might exist in a system that looks like this in the future.
Andrew Scott, I'll come to you next. For those who don't know, Andrew heads up the Australia Institute's Nordic Policy Centre. Andrew, what can we learn from how the Nordic countries approach this policy issue, and what are the implications for Australia?
Thanks, Ebony. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. Well, I think a key thing is that the whole idea of assuming that early childhood education and care should be a profit-driven, privatised process is not natural. It's not done everywhere. And I think one of the things we need to move the debate onto is free childcare, as it's being referred to in today's media, for example, with the Victorian and New South Wales government's temporary announcements, can mean paying subsidies to providers which make or to others, which make the cost of the privatised childcare, early childhood education and care free, or it can mean direct public free community provision. And given the educational component of early childhood education and care, that might seem to be a better approach. And it might actually be more economical too. We've seen in the past in Australia ABC Learning's collapse and the dangers of privatised, profit-driven providers. And we also know that if you keep giving subsidies to private providers in any field of policy, then their fees are likely to continue going up. So you need to keep giving higher subsidies and so on. Might it not be better, particularly given the idea of a productivity commission inquiry that the leader of the opposition nationally has suggested, to include looking at the possibility of direct, free, more public and more community-oriented early childhood education and care?
So are you talking there in terms of more along the lines of how we run primary school, for example?
Seeing, well, if you do seriously believe that early years education is important, and it is education, it's not just childminding, and if it's the most important, then surely it deserves more public provision and higher quality provision and support. And I think the Nordic countries do that to a greater extent than Australia. And I think there are lessons from there, including the economic benefits from that.
Thanks, Andrew. Kate, I might come to you first to respond to that.
Look, sure. I must admit, I think Australia has usually done better where we've had choice. You know, we've got choice in schools, you know, choice between public and private, because Australians seem to like choice. And there's some good examples where choice is in the system, such as Canada, Quebec. And the thing, so similar type systems to ours, where they have gone to affordable childcare. I think in Quebec it was down to $5 a day, but they did that by going to two things. They reduced the net cost of childcare, but they also fixed up the tax system so that marginal tax levels were not adversely affected by people working more hours in the workforce. So there's a range of ways of doing this, but I think we should continue to focus on the outcome here, and that is we want affordable childcare. I mean, for me, affordable childcare works better than absolutely free childcare, but hey, you know, we're all in a continuum here. But when you look at what's happened in say Quebec, you know, that they've got up to 80% participation rate of women in the workforce, and pretty close to 80% are working full time. Now, that's just not the case in Australia. We've got such a large percentage of women working part-time. At the same time as, I think it's 58% of university enrolments are women, and have been since the mid-80s. We're investing in women and education, fantastic, but then at the other end of that, not getting the return on that investment by having a childcare system that doesn't quite work. So I suppose for me, I like to look at it from, you know, both the economics of this, you know, the family bit of this, the early intervention bit, but looking at a system that, you know, does have a mix of public and private, but at the end of the day, the outcome is important. Affordable tax-affected childcare, which encourages women who want to work full-time.
Thanks, Kate. Jay, what's your response to that?
Yeah, look, I think, I think it's the critical issue here is I think first the healthy development of children. I mean I suppose that's our principal objective. But you can do two things at once. I think it's impossible to think about the healthy development of children without thinking about them in their context of their families and their communities. And so this, you know, I think at a fundamental level, we need to rethink how we perceive early childhood, and we need to reimagine early childhood in a way that children are at the centre, and those that care for them are given all the support that they need to also lead happy and fulfilling lives. I mean, the notion that that we should just allow these sort of families of young children just to struggle along, expect them to make big sacrifices around the way in which their careers, we essentially translate difference, that is women bear children into disadvantage. I mean, that's unacceptable. I mean, it as a society, we should all be taking full responsibility for our children and how they're nurtured and grow up. And I don't think we do that as a society at the moment. So at a really profound fundamental level, I think this involves a shift in how our attitudes to early childhood. And there are lots of models, I suppose, for doing that. In our campaign sense, what we've been doing though is focusing our attention about why there is a need for change. There's a lot of people in federal politics that actually think the current system's fine. The current system is based on a couple of big myths. One is that children can't learn until they go to school. And the second big myth is that really it's children are better off at home with their mothers entirely and exclusively. They're the two big myths. And there's a grudging acceptance that some of these women might want to go back to work, and so we'll throw them a little bit of support so that they can actually do that on a part-time basis. They're the sort of unpleasant truths about the trajectory of the current system. And, I think to the extent, it would be lovely if we could all spend, I suppose as much time as we want with our children growing up free of the sort of constraints, financial constraints. The truth is a lot of families don't have that choice because of the need to have two incomes coming in to support them. And also there's a well-being issue about any person, whether it's men or women, still wanting to fulfil their the development of their own careers, and that makes them their best selves, and that makes them into much better parents. So somehow we've got to find a way of being able to permit all of these things to happen, and it is a question of choice, it seems to me. The choice to actually live happy, healthy, fulfilling lives, and also making sure that your parenting role is supported. So, I just think a big rethink about how society comports itself in relation to the first 5 years is crucial.
Richard, did you want to add anything to that?
Look, if we were paying attention to the evidence, we'd have introduced free childcare years ago. If we were paying attention to the evidence, we would notice that we're having a royal commission into the aged care industry because our privatised aged care industry is not just incredibly expensive, but it's a dangerous place. If we were paying attention to the evidence, we remember that when we privatised vocational education and training, we saw systematic fraud and enormous expense, and a couple of very big listed companies cost a lot of people a lot of money. Look, we just like to tell ourselves in Australia that public subsidies to private companies to provide public goods is a good idea. It's been a spectacular failure in aged care. I fear it's going to be a spectacular failure in the NDIS. We know it was a spectacular failure in vocational education training. I suspect it will be a spectacular failure if we do it in childcare. But, we're all big kids. It's a democracy. No one's going to stop us making bad decisions. But there are countries like Norway and Denmark and Sweden and Finland, and if we want to learn from them, we can. They do exist. The internet's a wonderful thing. Or we can roll out our pretty flawed model of sort of publicly funded but privately provided.
Yeah, it's a bit damning when you roll them all out like that at once, Richard.
It's best that we don't, Ed, but it's better to be surprised each time it happens and, unintended consequences.
Yeah. The next question is from Victoria Taylor. She asks, do you think the way early childhood education policy has been framed by government and politicians as a social investment or a human capital issue during the crisis has led to inadequately addressing the gender inequality aspect in Australia? Kate, I might come back to you first on that one.
Well, certainly from, my perspective that the issues surrounding all of those women, who work and own small businesses, they've really been significantly disadvantaged through the whole COVID scenario. And remember, this is not just a few people; it's a very large number of women who are in this space. They're desperately trying to keep their businesses afloat through a really difficult time, but are struggling with the issue of childcare, and it hasn't been addressed. So from both a small business but also a gender perspective, this is just so negative, both for the people involved and for the families involved, but also for the economy. We need those people to be able to get their businesses up and running and get to employ again, to contribute to our economy. So, broadly, this is a problem. And of course, it goes broader, it goes much deeper than that a range of the parts of the economy that have been most affected by COVID are predominantly female. Right at the moment, my office is doing a lot of work with travel agents, and there's about 2,500 small businesses in the travel agent space. A very large percentage of them are run by women, and they really feel that they've been deserted at the moment. So, there's some very real issues out there at the moment.
And Kate, you were mentioning just before we went live here this morning about the fastest growing sector of small business.
Oh, yeah. Look, it's NAIDOC week, and I think one of the really important things to remember is the fastest growing sector in small business is actually Indigenous owned businesses. They're growing at about 12.5% a year, which is fantastic. An Indigenous business is 100 times more likely to employ an Indigenous person than a non-Indigenous business. And for every $1 of revenue that goes into an Indigenous business, it delivers about $4.41, I think, from memory, social benefit. Now, the reason for that is so many small businesses in the Indigenous space invest back into their communities. And I'll give you an example. There's a business called Kakadu Tots, which they make in Australia baby wear with original Indigenous prints, which is fantastic. They've grown very quickly over the years, but with the dollars that they've made, they're now investing in eco gardens to grow vegetables in remote Indigenous communities. So, there's a really good example of the way Indigenous businesses, tend to work, both employing but also reinvesting back into their communities. I could go on for a very long time on examples of really great Indigenous businesses that are investing in their communities, but we don't have time.
Thanks very much for that, though, Kate. An important point to acknowledge. Jay, coming back to you, we've got a question here from Melina Smith that I think touched on a point that you talked about earlier about one of the barriers. Melina asks, how can we have progressive policy direction for women and childcare when there's still a very conservative view amongst some that are stuck in the 1950s and that women should stay at home and that's best for children? Can you talk a little bit more about that point that you were raising earlier?
Yeah, I mean, look, the good news is that that's a minority perspective and is not. So we've tested the narratives that I've just mentioned about the brain development, the cost of living and discrimination against women. They're all very powerful. We've also tested our campaign goal, which is universal high quality early learning system for the country. Also very strong. About 2/3 of the country support this idea. A very small proportion of people don't agree with it, and then about 20% of people don't know. So it's a proposition that's strongly supported. So even though those voices might be overrepresented in the corridors of power that have some of these old-fashioned views about the role of women in society, they don't actually represent the majority perspective in the community. It's worth bearing that in mind because sometimes you get a skewed perspective about things because these same people might also have access to the airwaves. So I think we should have confidence about that. What's interesting about that data is it doesn't vary very much between Labor, Liberal, male, female, young, old. It's really, I mean, it's a little bit different, but it's fundamentally pretty similar across all those domains. So short answer is don't worry about them. They're not large and they're not. They are influential though, and of course, what is going to cause them to shift their perspective about this is to demonstrate essentially that the support in the community for this idea, and that's really the point of the campaign. So that's why behind me there's a little banner saying thriveby5.org.au, and we encourage people to jump on and register, and then you can see it'll provide you with the campaign journey about how we're trying to put pressure on the political process. But look, politicians, some of them lead, but usually they follow. And so it really, you have to demonstrate that there is pressure for change. So people have to raise their voices, and that's what we're trying to do, to actually create a sufficient group of people. And I think there's a lot of causes and a lot of people who've been trying to fight for these things for a long period of time are pretty exhausted. I know a lot of the educators themselves are feeling, pretty used and abused, and we know that those numbers, about 36% of them looking at leaving, were pre-COVID. So God knows what it's like now. So this is a sector that's feeling the pinch. I suppose the message to them and to the broader community is this is a campaign you can win, and I think the time is right. Not every political issue finds its time, but I think this one has found its time.
And I couldn't agree more with Jay on this, that it has found the time for a whole range of reasons, both economic and social, and the fact that we desperately need to increase productivity, increase jobs, and to grow the economy to get out of a recession and so on. So the importance of having different voices in this, campaign, from the business community, from the childcare community, the Minderoo Foundation, Chief Executive Women have launched a campaign which I'm involved with. There's a whole range of different groups that come from very different parts of the community with a slightly different take on it, but what we all want is similar or the same, and I think that gives us a real chance of pulling this off.
Yeah, Jay, I'll just come back to you. We've got a couple of comments in the chat that I can see about the language that we're using. And look, I have to admit, this isn't my particular area of expertise. I tend to defer to calling it childcare, but early childhood education, early learning. What is your campaign? How important is getting the language right about there to make people understand what early childhood education educators are actually delivering?
Yeah, and look, this is where there's this is a common discussion whenever I have a forum of this sort about why do we call it childcare, and surely it should be called early education and care, and the people working in the sector should be called early educators. And I can understand that the professional identity is critical, especially when you've been robbed of everything else, you're not paid properly and you've got precarious employment. These things professional identity becomes critically important, and people get very angry about the use of inappropriate language. But I think it's worth just having a few words about this, because the process of strategic communication doesn't start where you want to end. It starts where people are at the moment. If people understand this sector as the childcare sector, we have to use language they understand. If we start talking about early education, many of them will think that we're talking about preschool or even school. And so, if the critical thing here is not to persuade us. Most of the people who are actually potentially on this call are likely to be persuaded. So if we just keep talking to ourselves and making ourselves feel good, we're not going to advance a campaign. This is critically what we have to do, is move great masses of people out there, which involves starting with where they're at and through a process of discourse, taking them to where we want them to be. Ultimately, we do want them to understand that this is actually a system of early education. But many of them understand it as childcare. Many people don't actually understand that. Many see childcare is simply that, a place where they send their children and they hope that they're going to be safe and there's going to be a smiling face at the door. What we have to do, though, is to talk about it's much more profound than that. The way in which a child's brain develops is about the quality of those experiences. And so, but simply going straight to, describing it as the system we want is not necessarily the journey that we need to go on politically to take people on that journey. So I know it's frustrating for people when they hear childcare, but we are trying to reach people by using language that they understand.
Thanks very much. The next question is from Kirsty Starling, who asks, how can we bridge the gap in rural areas and have equal access to early learning for young children that a lot of urban areas already have? And how can we encourage local, state and federal government to invest in this? Kate, I might come to you first on this one.
Well, I'm probably, because I'm going to come from this from a business perspective, where if we can increase the demand for childcare significantly in those sorts of areas, and we can increase government support for those centres, then they will exist. If the private sector isn't willing to do them, then the public sector needs to, as exists in a range of countries that we've spoken about. It's pretty fundamental, that there's there are lots of people who need childcare in rural and regional areas. There's lots of women and young couples running businesses involved in all sorts of things out in those areas. So they need childcare. If the private sector doesn't do it, the public sector should. And we need to increase demand by making childcare affordable. I sort of believe that it all comes together.
Yeah. Jake,
Ebony,
the point you earlier made, you were talking about people really accessing early learning for the first time during the pandemic. Can you just explain a little more those figures?
Yeah, look, just also finishing up that point that Kate made, I think I cited a number before of 36%. It was actually 37% of the workforce are thinking of leaving in the long day care sector, but it's actually 45% in rural and regional Australia.
Yeah.
So this just underscores that you can't, I think, have a discussion about access without considering this question of the way in which we value early educators. But yeah, one of the pieces of feedback we had from SNAIC, the organisation that's the voice of early education for Aboriginal people, were that they saw substantial new families coming into their services during the period of so-called free childcare. And what that gave them was access to those families in a way that they didn't have before. And, of course, getting families through the door is the first step to be able to help them. And I think that, you could imagine a world where if there were few barriers to actually coming into these neighbourhood centres, they could become hubs, for even mothers before they have children, because we know how crucial that period is before the birth. And this just became part of life at the level of the neighbourhood, a safe place where trusted relationships were formed, where a whole range of, you can imagine completely renegotiating the relationship between a number of these communities and our child protection services, our infant and maternal services, all of the other adult services that are so crucial. I mean, it's impossible to talk about child wellbeing without also talking about the wellbeing of the mother and indeed the whole family. So, this is the possibility that's created for a universal system of this sort.
We've only got a couple of minutes to finish, so I might wrap up with, if you had a final message for government at any level on early childhood education, what would it be, Kate?
Oh, for me, this is about participation rates, it's about productivity, it's about jobs, and it's about well-being, both for families and for children going forward, all the things government should care about.
And Jay, for you, what would your message be?
Put it on the National Cabinet agenda. I noticed a list of national priorities were published the other day for the Premiers and the Prime Minister, and I couldn't see early childhood on that list. So that's something that we'd love to see. That's the starting point, getting the Commonwealth and the states and territories talking about this.
And Richard, a final word from you before we wrap up.
Just one shred of evidence that tax cuts would deliver more jobs than childcare. Just a glimmer, just an executive summary would be nice.
Good luck, Richard.
Don't need evidence when you're powerful.
Thank you so much for your time today, Kate Carnell, Jay Weatherill and Richard Denniss. We really appreciate it. I also want to thank everyone who's participated in today's webinar. Don't forget to head over to Thrive by 5 if you want to join the campaign. This has been a special episode of Follow the Money. All our webinars are free and available on the Australia Institute's YouTube channel. All our research and content is available at our website at australiainstitute.org.au, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a double N double T, and this episode was produced by Jennifer Macy. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeat from Pulse and Thrum. And remember, stay safe this summer, and thanks for listening.